Nobody expected 50 Cent to take it this far. When the first documentary dropped, most people thought that was the end of it. 4 episodes. A controlled release. Just enough truth to stir the pot, but not enough to burn the whole kitchen down. But behind closed doors, the real conversation was very different. Because according to people close to 50, what the public saw wasn't even half the story. There were scenes that never aired, names that were deliberately cut, claims so explosive they were labeled too risky to touch. And now, those same claims are quietly resurfacing. In recent weeks, 50 has been hinting that a second wave is coming. Not through Netflix, not through any major platform, but straight to the public, where there are no lawyers standing in the way and no executives hitting the brakes. And here's the part that has everyone nervous. This time, it's not just rumors. It's footage. It's testimonies. It's people who stayed silent for years suddenly deciding they're done protecting secrets that were never theirs to keep. And if even half of what's being whispered is true, this next drop won't just shake the industry. It could expose who really controlled it. When the documentary finally aired, most viewers thought they were watching a finished product. A clean narrative. A beginning, middle, and end. But according to people who were actually around the process, what the audience saw was a carefully trimmed version of something much bigger. Not because the material wasn't there, but because letting all of it out at once would have caused chaos nobody was ready for. Behind the scenes, 50 Cent wasn't celebrating. He was watching reactions. Who spoke up? Who stayed quiet? Who suddenly changed their tone? Because in his mind, the real documentary didn't start when the episodes dropped, it started after. That's when the messages came in. People who hadn't talked in years suddenly wanted to clear the air. Old names resurfaced. Former insiders, assistants, drivers, friends of friends. The kind of people who never make headlines but always know where the bodies are buried. And what they were telling him didn't contradict the documentary. It deepened it. One of the first things that came back up was a story that was intentionally left out. A story involving a woman whose name had already been whispered in hip-hop history, but never fully examined. According to sources, this woman wasn't just another chapter. She was a bridge between eras. A living connection between rivalries that were never resolved and grudges that never died. The allegation was simple on the surface, but devastating underneath. A hidden child. A relationship that crossed lines nobody talks about publicly. And a connection to Tupac that made producers uneasy the moment it was brought up. Not because it sounded unbelievable, but because it sounded too believable. People close to the editing process say that once timelines were laid out, things started overlapping in ways that raised uncomfortable questions. Questions that didn't accuse anyone outright, but suggested patterns. And patterns are dangerous, because they don't rely on one incident. They rely on repetition. That's where the conversation shifted. It stopped being about one allegation and became about behavior. Voices like T.K. Kirkland didn't come in throwing accusations. They came in explaining codes, street codes, cultural rules that don't need to be written down because everybody understands them. You don't cross certain lines if respect matters to you, especially not when you have unlimited options. And that's the part that stuck with people. When someone with money, fame, and access chooses one specific situation, especially one tied to an enemy, it stops looking accidental. It starts looking intentional. And when that intention lines up with years of public tension, the narrative takes on a darker shade. As the public debated motives, another voice stepped forward with a different kind of criticism. Gene Deal wasn't focused on who did what. He was focused on how the story itself was handled. According to him, the documentary borrowed heavily from conversations and concepts he had already presented long before cameras were rolling. He claimed ideas were taken, structures reused, and perspectives repackaged without acknowledgement. To some viewers, that sounded like bitterness. To others, it sounded like something much more familiar in the industry. history being told by whoever controls the platform. Gene's point wasn't just about credit. It was about omission. About stories that could have been included but weren't. He questioned why certain names were left out. Why certain women were barely mentioned. Why some situations were glossed over instead of explored. And that's where suspicion grew. Because when a documentary claims to expose truth but avoids the most sensitive parts, people start asking why. Was it about respect? Or was it about fear? That question became louder when the subject of power came up. Gene argued that if the documentary was truly false or defamatory, it would have been shut down immediately. Cease and desist. Lawsuits. Legal pressure. Instead, it stayed up. It circulated. It sparked conversations nobody could control anymore. To him, that silence spoke volumes. And then came the psychological angle. Jaguar Wright didn't talk about court cases or contracts. She talked about roots. About environments that shape people long before fame gets involved. According to her, you can't understand the man without understanding the child. What he saw. What he normalized. What was happening around him when nobody was supervising. She painted a picture of chaos disguised as freedom. Of strangers coming and going. Of adult situations unfolding in front of young eyes. And she suggested that when boundaries are blurred early, they don't magically reappear later, they just evolve. That perspective didn't excuse anything. It reframed it. Suddenly, the stories weren't isolated incidents. They were extensions of a long arc. One that began years before money, cameras, or power entered the picture. And that's when attention shifted to the women again. Not groupies. Not rumors. But long-term partners. Mothers. People who were there before the image was polished. According to multiple insiders, these women knew everything. Not because they were told, but because they lived it. They saw the contradictions. The rage. The paranoia. The control. Yet in the documentary, they were almost invisible. A few photos. A brief mention. Then silence. For viewers paying attention, that silence was louder than any allegation. Especially when rumors resurfaced about journals, manuscripts, and stories that were allegedly never meant to be published. Stories that, if released, wouldn't just embarrass someone, they'd implicate an entire ecosystem. As these conversations gained traction, old party stories resurfaced too. The legendary events everyone used to brag about. The guest lists that read like royalty. The rooms nobody photographed. The deals nobody discussed publicly. What stood out wasn't what was confirmed, it was who wasn't denying anything. Names that once defended now avoided the topic entirely. Former friends spoke in circles. Statements were vague, carefully worded, legal. And once again, the same question came up. If there's nothing there, why does everyone look nervous? As talk of a second release started circulating, the anxiety shifted from speculation to anticipation. Because unlike the first documentary, this next wave wasn't tied to a network. It wasn't subject to edits or approvals. It was rumored to be raw, fragmented, direct. Not a story, but a data dump. And if that's true, then this video was never meant to destroy anyone. It was meant to prepare people. Because once the rest comes out, there won't be room for deniability. Only memory. And accountability. And that's where things are headed next. Something else started happening quietly in the background. People weren't just talking anymore. They were repositioning. Old alliances softened. Former enemies suddenly shared the same silence. And those who once laughed off the rumors stopped laughing altogether. That's when it became clear this wasn't about a documentary anymore. It was about survival. According to insiders, after the first wave dropped, emergency conversations started happening in places the public never sees. Private homes. Back rooms. Encrypted calls. People weren't asking whether the stories were true, they were asking who else might talk next. Because the biggest threat wasn't what had already been said. It was what hadn't. One name that kept resurfacing in these conversations was Tupac. Not because he could respond, but because his shadow still looms over everything. Multiple sources believe the obsession didn't end in the 90s. It evolved. Relationships, associations, choices that seemed random until you line them up side by side. Women connected to Pac. Moments mirroring Pac. Speeches echoing Pac's words years later. To some, it looked like admiration. To others, it felt like something darker. An identity conflict that never resolved. And when unresolved identity meets unlimited power, the results can be unpredictable. That's why the rumors about unreleased footage are causing so much panic. Because footage doesn't debate. It doesn't reinterpret. It simply shows. And according to people close to 50, some of what he has doesn't accuse anyone directly. It just documents behavior over time. Patterns, proximity, reactions. And patterns are dangerous in a culture built on denial. The conversation then shifted toward control. Several former associates have claimed that surveillance wasn't just a metaphor, it was a lifestyle. Knowing who was talking, who was meeting, who was saying what behind closed doors. According to these stories, privacy was treated like a privilege, not a right. Phones monitored. Conversations repeated back verbatim. People confronted with information they never shared publicly. Whether all of that is true or not, the fear it created was very real. Because fear doesn't require proof, it requires consistency. Stories about explosive outbursts resurfaced. Moments when rage wasn't contained. When chairs flew. When rooms went silent. When people learned that saying the wrong thing around the wrong person could have immediate consequences. And then came the domestic rumors. Incidents that were once brushed off as accidents suddenly sounded different when placed next to everything else. Slips, falls, injuries explained away with convenient narratives. According to insiders, those stories didn't come from tabloids. They came from people who were there, watching the explanations change depending on who was listening. And still, none of this made it fully into the documentary. Which brought people back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. There are layers to this story that are still protected. Protected by money. Protected by influence. Protected by shared guilt. As attention turned to the legendary parties, the absence became impossible to ignore. For decades, those events were the center of everything. Politics, entertainment, sports, business. Everyone passed through those rooms at some point. Yet suddenly, nobody remembers anything. No stories. No specifics. Just vague nostalgia. That kind of selective amnesia doesn't happen naturally. It happens when too many people have too much to lose. That's why accusations started expanding outward. Not as legal claims, but as moral ones. If you were there and you stayed silent, what does that make you? A witness? Or an accomplice? And why did the same handful of names keep appearing whenever people talked about who benefited the most from staying quiet? Some former supporters rushed to distance themselves. Others released statements that said a lot without actually saying anything. And a few chose the safest option of all, disappearing from the conversation completely. Meanwhile, another theory began gaining traction. That the real story wasn't the industry at all. It was the household. Jaguar Wright doubled down on the idea that everything starts at home. That early exposure shapes desire, control, and identity. According to her, environments filled with adults living unchecked lives leave children learning the wrong lessons about power and intimacy. And when those children grow up with resources, they recreate those environments, only bigger and louder. She pointed to the strange pride expressed about criminal lineage. About wanting the myth. Wanting the image. Wanting to be connected to danger, even if it meant romanticizing trauma. And that mindset, she argued, explains a lot. It explains the need for control, the obsession with loyalty, the intolerance for betrayal. Because betrayal, in that framework, isn't just emotional. It's existential. Then came the most disturbing layer. Children. Multiple sources have raised concerns about young people being present in environments they never should have been exposed to. Not accusations. Observations. Questions about judgment. About boundaries. About why so many adults saw things and chose not to intervene. And when those concerns intersected with public images of family closeness, the optics became unsettling. Affection that felt performative. Oversharing that crossed comfort lines. Moments that made people ask whether certain relationships were healthy or simply normalized because nobody challenged them. At that point, the narrative stopped being gossip. It became a case study. A study of what happens when power goes unchecked for decades. When an entire ecosystem benefits from silence. When accountability is postponed so long that it starts to feel impossible. Which is why the idea of a second release is so terrifying. Because unlike the first documentary, this one isn't about storytelling. It's about exposure. Raw clips. Unedited conversations. Context stripped of polish. The kind of material that doesn't let viewers rationalize what they're seeing. And once that kind of information is public, nobody can claim ignorance anymore. That's what people are really afraid of. Not cancellation, not lawsuits, but memory. Because history has a way of rewriting itself once the truth surfaces. And if the video opened the door, video is standing in the doorway, waiting. And it doesn't look like it's leaving quietly. The tone around the industry had shifted completely. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was tension. The kind that hangs in the air when people know something is coming but don't know when or how hard it's going to hit. According to sources close to the situation, this final phase was never supposed to be public. It was meant to stay locked away as leverage, insurance in case certain lines were crossed. But once the first two waves landed and nothing was done to stop them, the calculation changed. Silence was interpreted as weakness. And weakness invites exposure. What made this video different wasn't new accusations. It was convergence. Separate stories that had lived in isolation for years began lining up. Timelines matched. Names overlapped. Locations repeated. People who had never met were suddenly describing the same rooms, the same moods, the same unspoken rules. And when those accounts were laid side by side, the picture became disturbingly clear. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. Former insiders described an environment built on hierarchy. Not just fame but access. Who could come and go. Who could speak freely. Who needed permission just to exist in certain spaces. Loyalty wasn't requested. It was expected. And once you benefited from that access, leaving quietly became the only safe option. Because leaving loudly meant consequences. Several stories centered around people who tried to distance themselves. Careers stalled. Opportunities disappeared. Calls stopped being returned. Not in dramatic ways. In subtle ones. The kind that can't be proven but can definitely be felt. According to those accounts, the message was always the same. Remember where you came from. And more importantly, remember what you saw. That's where the paranoia comes in. Multiple people have claimed that the fear wasn't just about retaliation. It was about exposure. About who might remember something wrong. Who might misinterpret a moment. Who might tell a story without realizing how many other stories it connects to. In that kind of environment, control becomes an obsession. Control over narratives. Control over people. Control over history itself. Which is why the idea of raw footage is so dangerous. Not because it shows crimes, but because it shows culture. Behavior that was normalized in private but never meant to be scrutinized publicly. Jokes that don't land the same years later. Power dynamics that look different once the curtain is pulled back. And once that footage exists outside of anyone's control, the spell breaks. Another unsettling element that began resurfacing was the role of intermediaries. Fixers. Go-betweens. People whose job was to smooth things over, make problems disappear, keep situations handled. According to insiders, these figures operated in shadows, rarely named, but always present when something needed to be cleaned up. They weren't villains. They were systems. And systems don't collapse easily, but they do leave trails. Trails in financial records. Trails in travel logs. Trails in the memories of people who were paid to forget but never fully did. As more of these fragments came together, the conversation shifted one last time, away from the accused and toward the audience. Because the biggest question became uncomfortable. How long did we all know? How many rumors were laughed off because the music was good? How many red flags were ignored because the parties were legendary? How many stories were dismissed because the truth felt inconvenient? This video doesn't accuse the industry of creating monsters. It accuses it of feeding them. Feeding them silence. Feeding them protection. Feeding them applause while looking away. And that's why this final chapter doesn't end with a revelation. It ends with reflection. Because even now, as people wait to see whether more footage will actually drop, the reactions tell their own story. Some are preparing statements. Some are deleting old photos. Some are rewriting history in real time. And some are hoping the internet gets bored. But the internet doesn't forget. Once a narrative shifts, it never fully goes back. The questions linger. The doubts remain. And even if nothing else ever comes out, the damage is already done. Not to one person, but to the illusion that power operates without consequence. Responsibility for the stories we ignored. Responsibility for the people we protected. Responsibility for the culture we celebrated without asking what it cost. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one documentary or one figure. It's about what happens when truth is delayed long enough to rot. And whether we're finally ready to deal with the smell. And now we're left sitting in the quiet that comes after the noise. Because if everything that's been hinted at was real, exaggerated, or completely made up, this story would already be over. There would be court filings instead of silence. Public denials instead of carefully worded statements. Closure instead of tension. But that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is hesitation. People choosing their words carefully. Others choosing not to speak at all. Old allies stepping back. Familiar faces suddenly wanting no part of a past they once proudly stood in. And that should make you pause. Because powerful people don't get nervous over nothing. The real question isn't whether more footage exists. It's why so many people are afraid of it. If a second drop never happens, this story still doesn't disappear. The patterns have already been laid out. The connections have already been made. And once the public starts asking the right questions, those questions don't just go away. So think about this. If the first documentary was allowed to exist, what does that say about the power people think they still have? And if the next one comes out without filters, without edits, without permission, who does it really expose? This isn't about picking sides anymore. It's about paying attention. Because history doesn't always reveal itself in one big moment. Sometimes it leaks out slowly, until there's no way to ignore it.